if we could just give a round of applause. We have had folks from Philadelphia and from New Orleans and from Bridgeport, Connecticut all weekend here to support us in trying to get our brother Brandon here. They have come in person. They have been on the phones. They have been, whenever we have called and asked for them, they have been present. So if we could just give a round of applause to our comrades across the nation. We appreciate you. And I just want to acknowledge that as they tell these stories, the same as when we tell our story about what happened to us here in Chicago with 50 school closings in 2013, that this is re-triggering. It's traumatizing. I think back and go back to board meetings where I saw young people and parents crying, begging, pleading for these folks not to close their schools. And I think about how many thousands of young people had to prioritize their safety and just said, I can't cross over and go to school at the place that they're now telling me I have to go to school. And so we lost them. We don't know where they went, where they are. And so as you hear the stories from Philadelphia and also from New Orleans, again, I just want to recognize that the folks who are telling these stories are, again, also reliving their traumas. And so once again, if we can just show them that we appreciate them and appreciate the efforts and the support that they are giving us in this moment so that we can do right by the city of Chicago, and not just by the city of Chicago, but by the nation. The world is watching you all. They are watching to see how Chicago responds in this moment. And this is going to determine what leaders around the nation will or will not do. So this is more than just a Chicago fight. But I want to welcome up Jen Conant, who is from our charter division. She's going to be a part of our panel today. Thank you, Jen. We also have with us Viola Curry from the Philadelphia Teachers Union, and she's with us remotely. Viola, if you can wave for us. And then we also have Dr. Ashonta Wyatt, who again has been with us all last weekend. She's now hopefully back home, but every time we have called on her to give her testimony, she has been willing and ready. And so Dr. Ashonta Wyatt is also here with us from New Orleans. So we're gonna jump right in, and just first, if we can just have you all talk about your role when Valles was in your city, and just talk about what was the plan when Valles came to your city? What was the plan? And then how was that plan implemented? We'll just start there, okay? So we'll start in Philadelphia, because we know that after Valles left Chicago in 2001 because his policies failed, that he went and took those same failed policies to Philadelphia. And so if we can have Ms. Curry, if you could just tell us your role, what you were doing at that time, and what was Valles' goal and how he implemented that plan.
Okay, I'm starting out. My name is Vi Curry, and at the time when Paul Vallas came to Philadelphia, I was a staff representative for the Philadelphia Federation of Teachers. And I had a region or a district or an area of schools, about 50 schools that I was responsible for at that time. His purpose, and I do have to preface by saying that we had a Republican governor at that time who disbanded our local school board and set up a 5-member panel of commissioners. 3 were appointed by the governor and 2 by the mayor of Philadelphia. Surprisingly, these Republicans brought Paul Vallas in as to head the school district. Not a superintendent, since he was not a teacher, so he was then called a CEO. His purpose was, and their purpose was, to charterize schools in Philadelphia, pro-choice, pro-vouchers, bringing in managers to run our schools and to privatize them. And of course, after he got here, he threw universities into the mix as well. And I had two of my elementary schools that were run by the University of Pennsylvania, which was a disaster. They felt that they were going to teach teachers how to teach, but my staffs felt that they knew more than what they were trying to provide for them in the way of professional development. They did not relate or connect with the staff, the students, or the community. And I stated before that, and I again hope I was not offending anyone, but I, along with some of the other folks, felt the staff at the schools that the University of Penn felt they were going to be the great white hope for our children in our community, and that was not the case. With the support and help of our current president, Jerry Jordan, who supported me and the staff, we were able to get the University of Penn out of one of my schools. But that was his purpose, was then to turn these schools over, to give them more power over the schools, and also to break our union. And I'm going to say that. That was another major purpose. And he felt that his program could not succeed and did not succeed because we were too powerful. And thank God for Jerry, who was our director of staff and chief negotiator at the time, that he didn't win those battles. He had stated before that the EMOs didn't get the autonomy that they needed in the schools to do what they wanted to do. And that was a major, major problem. You want me to go on to other things? or to hold off? I don't hear you.
We can hold off right there just for a second. So we're hearing privatize, we're hearing bring in other folks to tell teachers who are actually been in the community, no students, no parents, no community members, bring in other folks who can tell those teachers how to teach and what to do, and that was a disaster, and bust teachers unions. And he said he wasn't successful in Philadelphia because the teachers were too powerful. So I want to actually go on over to Dr. Wyatt, because what they couldn't do in Philly, they then went to New Orleans and said, oh, we got a way to do it in New Orleans though. And so Dr. Wyatt, if you could introduce yourself and talk about the ways or the plan that Paul Vallas had when he came to New Orleans and how that plan was implemented.
Good morning. I'm so honored to be here with you. So in 2007, merely 2 years after the devastation that was Hurricane Katrina, my city was introduced to Paul Vallas. He came in as the superintendent of the RSD. Again, minus the credentials to call himself a superintendent, but nevertheless, he was our superintendent of the Recovery School District. They called it the Recovery School District because they sold the bill of goods to my community by saying that they were going to help us recover. They were going to bring our families back. They were going to open our school buildings. They were going to remediate our school buildings, give our children something nice and comfortable and clean and safe to come back home to. And so with the assistance from the state superintendent, Paul Pastorak, Paul Vallas had complete autonomy over the educational institutions in the city of New Orleans. His first act as superintendent was to fire 7,500 veteran educators. He did this so he can usher in Teach for America. Most of those people who came to us from Teach for America also had no grounded pedagogy and education, no training, no university degrees. Granted, some of them were degreed in other fields, but they were not teachers. And so what you had was an imbalance of professionals in classrooms. And so by and large, the schools that were predominantly Black were the Teach for America personnel were employed there. And then the veteran educators that did return and who were not fired, who were not also Black, they were all housed in the schools that were predominantly white children would go. And so what he did was destabilize education in New Orleans. What he did was destabilize our middle class in New Orleans. What he did was privatize the public good that is education. What he did was to facilitate this. I want to also make certain that you guys know this. When he came to New Orleans to take over the failure, 60% was the measuring stick. So any school that was 60% or below was supposed to be the school he would take. Well, when he realized he would only get 5 schools, they then moved the measuring stick from a 60% to an 87.4. So any school that was an 87.4 SPS below, he took them over, which gave him 100 of our schools. When the RSD and the charter management operators took over all of our schools, they then moved the measurement back down to a 49.9. So that way they can mask their failures. So if you were a 49.9 or above, you would consider passing, so that at the state level, it would look like he was making progress when really he was just moving the numbers and moving the percentages to mask his failures. And so what he did was privatize public education, displace and fire 7,500 of our educators, usher in a replacement educational model that has not worked in our schools. Right now, we only have a handful of schools that are doing well in New Orleans, but it is the same handful of schools that were doing well when he came here. So nothing about what he instituted in New Orleans is working. Our children are failing at astronomical levels. 72% of them cannot read on grade level. They graduate and go to college with a 6th grade reading level. So most of them drop out. And I heard you say earlier that you don't know where your kids are. They've closed over 50 schools in New Orleans. We do not know where our children are. We're losing them to other states. We're losing them to homeschool. We're losing them to private school, but they're not in our public schools. And that is all due in part to the leadership or the non-leadership of Paul Vallas. He knows what he did, which is why he left. That's why he left Philly, because he knew the stuff was going to hit the fan and he had to go. So then he came to New Orleans, and when he knew it was going to hit the fan in New Orleans, he left and went to Haiti and Chile. So this is his track record. This is his legacy. Everything he builds is failure. Everything he touches, he decimates. So Chicago ought not to want that back in their city. He is no good for Chicago. He's no good for Black children.
I agree.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go back to you, Vi, because one of the things that Valles has touted and that his cronies have touted here in Chicago is that he's a financial fixer, right? That he comes in and he's able to balance budgets, right? And so that's the reason why there was a shift in 1995 in the first place, from moving from someone heading Chicago public schools that had an education background to a CEO, moving into that business model. So what would you say to folks who talk about his financial expertise? What state did he leave Philadelphia in financially?
He truly was a budget fixer, and he fixed us in Philadelphia to the tune of having a deficit of over $70 million. Now, he claims it was only 40 million, but we know it was more like $73 million as a deficit when he left Philadelphia. He spent and spent and spent. He gave more money per pupil, even to the charter schools and the managers that came in to oversee the schools, than we had in public schools. He got rid of our headquarters, school district headquarters, which was historically certified, bought another building, which cost over $30 million to try to get it operational. He tried to reduce some of the deficit by going into the schools, taking artwork that had been given to the schools to try to sell it. He also was going to try to reduce the number of chauffeurs that they had. And one of the commissioners wanted to know, why do you have chauffeurs, all these chauffeurs anyway? And another commissioner felt that if you're going to take the artwork out of the schools to sell it, you're like raping the schools. So yeah, he was a real fixer for what he did. Even money, he received a $5 million grant money from the Department of Education for a program for teacher pay for performance. Of course, that didn't go through with us. So he took that money and gave that to charter schools as well. So he left us in a real bind and a real fix that years later was a major problem in trying to staff schools. We lost teachers, we lost supportive people in schools, we lost resources, and it was a major problem that we had for years even after he left.
Well, I want to bring in Jen Conant, since we're talking a lot about charter schools, right? We know that that Paul Vallas is pro-charter. We're seeing that in every place that he goes. And so just want to turn to you, Jen, and talk about, what you've learned about Vallas in the time and since this election runoff or just this election time. What have you learned about charter schools as far as your leadership? What have you learned about Vallas that has informed your leadership of our charter division here in Chicago?
Thanks, Monique. I think there's this perception that Vallas is pro-charter. What we're saying in the charter division is he's pro-charter operator, right? He's not pro-charter educator. He's not pro-charter student. He's not pro-charter family. And he really stands opposed to everything that we're fighting for to improve our schools in the charter space. And so we're being really upfront about that with our members. We want to talk about it with students and families as well, that just because someone wants to open more charter schools or privatize a space doesn't actually mean that they have the best interests of students at heart, right? We know that opening more schools is bad for all of the schools that already exist. It means that there's less money and fewer resources to go around. And so that's something that we continue to fight. We believe in the charter moratorium, that's really important. We wouldn't want Valles to become mayor and get rid of that and open new schools. So this is an existential fight for all of us. Having Valles as mayor would hurt all of our public schools, both district and the charter schools that already exist. And we're really seeing right now, we're negotiating 12 different contracts in the charter space, and we're coordinating our negotiations there. We're fighting for things that would improve all of our schools, both charter and district schools. We see this as part one of a two-part campaign. So we're negotiating first in the charter sector, and then next it'll be in the district. And we're really being intentional about what we're asking for, what we're fighting for, and trying to set standards for all of our schools across the city. The charter model is, try to do education for less, and it's not a successful model. And we're showing in the charter space that in order to have good schools, you have to pay the educators in the building well so that they can stay, right? So we're fighting that churn and burn model. And saying there are standards that you have to meet in terms of staffing, in terms of the education that you provide. And by unionizing the charter space, we've really been able to stop charter expansion because it's no longer profitable for charter operators to open more and more schools, right? Because now they have to face a teachers union, an educators union that says, we're not going to let you do wrong by our students, right? We're going to hold you accountable to the promises that you're making to our families. And we're going to continue to fight for that.
Thank you so much for that. I want to actually take that and talk to you again then, Dr. Wyatt. We've heard from both now in Chicago and also in Philadelphia that the teachers union and the unionizing of charters has been one of the things that has been able to stifle, right, the charter proliferation. So can you talk to us, Dr. Wyatt, about the effect of Paul Vallas and his cronies on the teachers union in New Orleans?
So much like our teacher base, he also decimated our ability to unionize. We have UTNO, which is the United Teachers of New Orleans, but the power that they once had pre-Katrina, it no longer exists here. They're struggling to get our schools unionized because I'm not sure if you guys are aware, but 100% of our schools are chartered. And so it's very hard for UTNO to move in those spaces to try to engage teachers to talk about unionizing because retaliation is very real here. teachers have lost their jobs if they speak up against anything that is going on inside of the school that goes against the safety or well-being of children and educators. They are fired. And because we're at will state, they don't have to give a reason why you're fired. You can just come into work on a Monday and be unemployed on Tuesday, and you have no recourse because you have no union to go and fight for you. So there are entities right now in our system that are trying to unionize their school, but by and large, across a network of schools, we don't have that because we have charter management operators. And so, for instance, the charter management operator won't allow the union to come into their operation to even engage teachers. So if the head of these CMOs don't want the union in their schools, the teachers don't have a recourse to unionize. And if they try to self-unionize, they're going to be fired. They're going to be removed, and they don't have to give a reason. And it's very hard for teachers to get legal advice or legal representation because you're trying to pay your rent and pay for groceries. You can't afford a lawyer. And so most teachers rather stay silent and employed than to speak up and risk unemployment. So I told my people when I came back to New Orleans, I absolutely love what is happening in Chicago, and I hope it can be infectious and work its way here, because what Chicago is showing New Orleans is that it's possible, that fear can't reign. We can't be fearful and stay silent, because as long as we're silent, the remnants of Paul Vallas will still hold us hostage here in this city. And so what you guys are doing, we can't even get started because every CMO, they're detached from each other. There's no school system. There's a system of schools here. So it's very hard to fight for your right to have due process here in New Orleans because there's no unified system to go to. Every school is trying to unionize themselves if that's what they're trying to do. But I believe of the 71 schools we have, there's only a handful of them that are represented by a union. And it's very dangerous. And I'm speaking to you as a person who is going into my 5th year of unemployment with a doctorate degree in education, because I spoke up against malfeasance in my school. And it took 5 years for the FBI to indict my school, my board president, but he has been indicted and sentenced to 5 years because he stole the money that was meant for my children and bought cars and homes and fancy dinners. But I was made to be a pariah in my city because I spoke up. And when I spoke up, I was fired. And this is my 5th year of unemployment because of that. It wasn't until this year that people started to say she did tell the truth, because the Department of Justice indicted him and the judge sentenced him to 5 years. And so it took 5 years. Some families can't afford to go 5 years without an income, so they rather stay silent. So we do not have what you guys have in Chicago in terms of a powerful union. But I'm hoping that what you're doing in Chicago, I'm hoping with the appointment of Brandon Johnson, that New Orleans will wake up and see that the power structure that is privatization is not more powerful than the people when we unionize.
Can I,
Thank you so
Monique,
much.
may I also just clarify, because in Philadelphia, we had a difficult time trying to unionize charter schools. It took us years to finally unionize one charter school, and we had a staff person assigned just for that. But the same thing that you were speaking of in New Orleans, they threaten people, they fire people, they threaten to take their job away if they would put the union in there. And because of charter schools and the other managers coming in and taking over our schools, where we once had about 17 to 18,000 members, our membership now is down to about 12,000. And that's a result of charters and other for-profit managers coming into the schools and taking them over. We have lost.
Thank you so much for that. I hope we are making the connections, right, between the disrupting of communities, no longer any neighborhood schools, union busting, so people can't get together and organize within the buildings, right? Like, this is what Paul Vallas does, and this is the reason why he is able to move in the way he's able to move, disrupting communities, disruption of school communities. And so if you could just talk about what that union busting, what that disruption of community has meant for the students, what has that meant for the young people within New Orleans and also Philadelphia, not just in school terms, but just their well-being.
So here in New Orleans, they're a group called IWIS. It's the Institute of Women in Ethnic Studies. They actually did a trauma study on our children. 60% of our children have diagnosed PTSD, and it's diagnosed, but it's unaddressed. Because what the charter management operators have done is they've pulled every resource out of our schools in terms of social work, in terms of counselors. Our schools don't even have librarians. And so what you do to a child who is suffering and can't get the help that he or she needs, you relegate them to try to manage those emotions on their own, which is a direct correlation to our spike in juvenile crime here in New Orleans. The children of this city have this city under siege. People can't even go to pump gas without being carjacked. And that is not to lay the blame at the foot of children. That is to lay the blame at the foot of a broken system. Because what is happening to our school system is a direct reflection of what is happening in our communities. Our kids cannot read, so there's no way to go and get a sustainable job. You can't fill out an application. And so what the disruption of public education has done to New Orleans, you cannot measure in dollars and cents. Paul Vallas owed our children more than he could afford to ever repay. And what I'm telling Chicago is you do not want to be like New Orleans. We have 72% of children not reading on grade level. 60% of them are suffering from PTSD, and more than 50% of our schools are D and F schools. D and F, and a large majority of them are C's, and it's a fraudulent C because it's a 48 and a 46 and a 42. Anywhere else in the country, that is failure. But in New Orleans, that is basic. That is basic. The only measurement that Paul Vallas and this charter structure has been unable to touch is ACT scores, because they can't fudge those numbers. And I will tell you that we have the worst test scores since 2006. We have the lowest ACT scores. We have the lowest scores on the National Assessment of Education Practices. So it's everything he touched, he decimated. And it all started with the takeover of our schools in 2007. And also, I want you to understand that it was because we were predominantly Black and predominantly poor. And I will go up against anybody who begs to differ, because we have parishes surrounding New Orleans that are predominantly white and predominantly poor, but they didn't take them over. And they were failing at a much larger rate than New Orleans was. So the takeover was because we were Black and because we were poor, and because when white folk come into Black communities and sell a bill of goods, they do so on the back of this Superman complex, like they're going to save us. We didn't need our schools to be saved. We needed our children to be taught. We needed our children to be loved. We needed our children to be heard. And he did none of those things because they came in and told our people to teach like champions. Well, I don't know a champion that calls themselves a champion with a losing record. He's not winning anywhere he goes. He's not a champion of anything. He is an architect of disaster. And Chicago has to say no. And I'm hoping you guys win, because a win for you is a win for New Orleans. You're going to wake my city up with the election of Brandon Johnson. And that is why when you call me, I come. So that is our testimony. Do not be like New Orleans. This is a graveyard for Black children. You don't want to continue to bury children. The reason why kids are picking up guns in Philly and Chicago and New Orleans, look at the education system. Look at the affordable housing. Look at the fact that they can't feed their families. And then you're going to understand why Paul Vallas is a cancer. And the only thing you could do with cancer is to eradicate it. You can't try to treat it, because all he's going to do is come back bigger and stronger with more money. You have to get rid of him for good, so that he doesn't pick another vulnerable city to go and take advantage of. If he loses in Chicago, he loses forever. Say no to Paul Vallas.
I agree with what you say 100%. He hasn't done anything for the community. And again, in Philadelphia, we are a predominantly Black school district as well. And because of the deficit that he left with us, which caused a breakdown in services to our students, and support services to our students. It made a cut in athletics and sport programs, which is another thing that also helped keep some kids in school and to go further in college, to go to college. And one of the things that he did not do, he did not reduce the dropout rate. That remained the same. And because of the cut in services to school and personnel in schools, it also created more violence in the schools as well.
Thank you again so much for that. Again, I hope we are making the connections, right? Talking about the crime and the young people in New Orleans just reminds me of here in Chicago. Our young people are in crisis.
That's right.
Our young people are in crisis. But we got two opposing ways or two directions on how they are going to be, how their trauma is going to be addressed. We know Paul Vallas does not care anything about the trauma of Black children. He came into New Orleans while there was still water in people's homes and decimated their school system. He does not care about the trauma of a natural disaster. So he does not care about a COVID pandemic and the impact that that has had on our children. This election is really about two opposing forces that are at play in the United States right now. We saw in 2020 more talk about dismantling systemic racism than we had in an entire generation. And soon after, we saw the status quo get in formation to say, oh no, you won't dismantle this system of profit that we have built. And so now we see the attacks on Black history. We see the attacks on critical race theory. And then someone has the audacity to say, we shouldn't be looking at race. This is about race. Because Paul Vallas would not be allowed to travel to city after city, causing damage and devastation and harm. He would not be allowed to do that with white children. So we know that what happens here in Chicago is a representation of what is possible across this nation. This is about more than just our fight. This is about these two opposing forces, because what happens here is a demonstration of what is possible across the nation, across the globe. So we thank you so very much, Vi, and also Dr. Wyatt. We hope that really what you have put on our minds today will stay with us, that we will talk to other folks about it, that we will talk to our family members, we'll talk to our students, we'll talk to anybody we possibly can before April 4th, because you are comrades with us, and we are here also to support you in helping to heal the trauma that has been done to your cities. So we are going to elect Brandon Johnson, and then we're going to take this fight and this movement to your cities to take back over your education systems. So for these last 2 minutes, I'm just going to let you, once again, you are talking right now to school union leaders in Chicago. And so if you just have any last words to leave with them about what we need to do in this really pivotal moment.
I would just say this, which is something that we tell our union school reps, to make sure you get the people out to vote. Not just your family members and your neighbors, work the polls. But what we also had them to do was work the polls at the school where they taught, because they knew those families. So when you think about it, when those families are coming in or picking up their kids and they want to go vote, you're right there. But we have to get out the vote. That's the main thing. Whether you're going to do phone banking in the evening to say, did you vote? You got to get that vote out. And I wish you the best in getting Brandon elected. Thank you.
Vi.
Yeah, so I'll echo that. I'm excited. Like Brandon is going to be my mayor. So
He is
I'm
going to be your
excited.
man.
So what I would say to the city of Chicago is, You can send a clear message to billionaire privatizers, and you can let them know that they have all of the money, but we have all of the power, because the power to elect Brandon Johnson lies with the people of Chicago. And you can send a very, very clear message to all of the people who believe that Black children can be bought, that Black children are for sale. You can say no to privatization. I will have you know that this is a $6 billion experiment happening in New Orleans. $6 billion. They're spending $40 to $50 million to transport our children from failing school to failing school, when all of that money could be invested in the communities and in real educators and in real opportunities for growth. And so it shows you what they care about. My grandmother always said, if you want to show somebody what you value, show me what you spend your money on. And they're spending money to undereducate or miseducate our children. So that tells you that they know we are powerful people when we have the right tools and resources to educate our young. So Chicago, stand up, use your voice and use it for change. Because when you elect Brandon, you're gonna light a fire under this country like nobody has ever seen. And you're gonna send a message to all of the people who think our children are expendable. Not today, not ever. Brandon Johnson for Chicago. He's your only choice. He's our only choice.
Thank you.
And by the way, you can send me, get one of those Chicago Teachers Union shirts for me as well.
Absolutely. On the way. Jen, do you
Okay.
want to also close us out? What do we need to do in this moment as you talk to your union brothers and sisters?
We'll definitely get to the polls. The one other thing I'd add, we're in contract negotiations. They're heating up. If you hear about rallies or events, if you can come out and support, so we can hold our charter operators accountable to actually serving our students and our staff well, that is another way to tell the privatizers that they cannot win.
And hands off our babies. All right. Thank you so much. We thank you so much.
Thank
Vi
you.
and
Thank you.
Dr. Ashonta
Thank
Wyatt.
you.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.